All right, this is Ela Jarvis with Beginning Watercolor, and this is our 6th exercise. So we are finally painting a picture. We've been doing all sorts of mixing and swatching and testing out colors and seeing what they can do. And now we're going to do kind of a paint by numbers sort of a thing. Not by numbers, but we're, Bob Ross it. We're going to have following steps together to make a picture. This particular exercise I originally got from this book, The Watercolor Course You've Always Wanted by Leslie Frantz, which is an excellent book. I'd say it's a little bit more on the advanced side, but she does give really great information. And the first painting exercise she gives is for this picture. And I'm going to emphasize different things than she does in her instructions. But basically in the book, she gives you this photo. And the nice thing about this photo is that it contains red, yellow, and blue. This looks like an autumn day, probably in the sun, in the evening. So we've got, the trees are sort of reddish on the top. We have the warm golden sun shining on the trees. We have deep, cool shadows. The grass is turning yellow. And the sky is just very slightly blue. Not very blue in the photocopy and maybe not on your screen. But, you can make it, we're going to make it a little bit more blue, or at least I'm going to. One of the main things that I find that beginning students struggle with, and even people who've been painting for a while, is we get really attached to the original source for a picture. If you're not working abstractly and you're painting from life, you're painting from a photo, it drives you nuts that your picture does not look exactly like your original photo. And so this exercise is going to get us over that. I mean, you can paint this a million different ways, but we're going to do a very loose, free version of it, kind of something like this. And your picture will not look just like this. My painting doesn't look exactly like hers, and every time I paint it, it looks a little bit different. And you can make it really quite different on purpose if you wanted to. You could use different colors. You could get into the fact that this tree doesn't really have any leaves on it. You could use an orange. You don't have to use anyway. Just trust me, you can have fun. So I'm going to break this down into a couple of different steps. The first one is we're going to do an underpainting. So you can see there's these hard edges, but there's also color in the background. If I wanted to, I could, just try paint the trees and paint the sky and carefully go around the trees, but that would be very, very tedious. And everything's kind of neutral and autumnal anyway. So instead, we painted the blue and some other colors below, let it dry completely. So that's the underpainting. And then once it's completely dry, then we did a second layer of intense colors. And following this technique follows the rule from working from light to dark. This is a pretty typical thing in watercolor. You don't start with your deepest, most intense colors. You save those for the very end. And when you start with a painting, you start with the most diluted colors and slowly build more and more dark as you go. The reason for this is if you try and paint on top of very intense, concentrated colors, they will often bleed. Very, very light colors are more likely to be absorbed in the paper. They're more likely to stay where they're put and not run around when you get them wet again. So I'm going to show you how to do an underpainting. And for this underpainting, we're going to do a technique that is unique to watercolor called wet into wet. And so I'm going to use 3 colors in this background, and I've mixed these colors in advance. And just to keep on the theme of the other videos that I've made, I'm continuing with the same colors. I have phthalo blue, There might be a little bit of ultramarine in there, but it's primarily phthalo blue. And then I have that cadmium yellow, and then I have that alizarin crimson red. So we're going to make a painting out of those colors that we've been playing with. And I could just put them directly on the paper, but they would be rather intense, and there would be a risk of them drying before I'm ready. This is one of the challenges of watercolors. Either you're going very, very fast, or else you're sitting around and waiting for paint to dry. Now, since we want a very pale background color, one way to avoid our paint from drying faster than we want is we can wet our paper before we even start. I mean, we want a very pale underpainting anyway. So I'm going to use my largest brush, very absorbent mop-like brush. You can tell there's a little bit of yellow on my brush. I'm going to rinse it out. It's okay. It's very pale. This is an Imitation Squirrel number 2 brush by Raphael, but any big brush that you have that holds a lot of water that will cover quickly will do a good job. If you have a flat brush, a brush that's very wide and flat, those would work really well. What you don't want is a tiny little pointy brush. You want the biggest brush you have. If you have time, you may even want to go out and purchase a brush. If you're watching this on the video, I would say, you know, if you want to do a round, maybe get at least a size 12, if not larger, or a brush that's about an inch wide. And clearly a watercolor brush, an acrylic brush. A brush for acrylic might also work, but they won't be as absorbent. Watercolor brushes would be the best. And you can always tell a watercolor brush because it has a short handle. But imitation school brushes hold a lot of water and are perfect for this technique. So I can see the texture of the paper anywhere where it's puddly. I'm removing a little bit of it. I can kind of tilt my head in a different light and see. Yeah, that looks good. I don't see any dry spots on there. So I have mixed colors in advance, and you can see I didn't use the tiny palette. This palette is too small. It would be very difficult to mix enough of these 3 colors on this palette. I want to, you know, especially if I was working really large, I would be asking for trouble. So I have diluted these colors in advance. And I can show you here what they look like. So I just mixed water and red, and I stir it around a little bit just to make sure that that pigment is not settling on the bottom of the palette. If you don't have any palettes like this, you can use a ceramic plate. Just make sure that you really wash it. It may stain, just as a warning. So here it is. And you can see it does lighten up a little bit when it dries. And it will lighten up even more on this paper because I'm going to be mixing it with this wet surface. So water is going to be mixing in with this paint. But we're just doing an underpainting. It's supposed to be pale. That's fine. And here's what the yellow looks like. Stirring up my yellow. I don't want that pigment to be sitting on the bottom of the palette. Doesn't look that different. But that's okay. If it's diluted a little bit, it's fine. Point is we want 3 distinct pale colors. So now I'm stirring around my blue. So that's phthalo blue. That's been heavily diluted with water. So first I just put water in there, and then I just add a little bit of paint at a time until I get the concentration that I want. Like I said, it will be paler once it touches this wet paper that has all that water already on it. And then it'll dry paler still. So when I look at the original picture, I see that about 2/3 of the page is blue. And then I'm going to put a light shade of pink. And it's very faint in the original photo. But we can exaggerate it. It'd be more fun to have a pink line in there. It'll really give that feeling of autumn and evening by having a little bit of pink. So I'm dipping my brush in my phthalo blue. It's the color I have the most of here. And I'm just going to touch along the top. I can spread it around a little bit. If my paper curls a little bit, that's okay. That's not uncommon with wet paper. Sometimes people will tape paper down, or they'll staple it, or people talk about stretching their watercolor paper, which is something you have to do a day ahead of time and often creates holes in your paper. You soak your paper for 10 minutes and then staple the wet paper onto a board and let it dry overnight. And I've done it before and I find it tedious. And I just put up with paper that curls slightly, and that's and I'm not the only one who does it like that, or I just ignore it. Okay, so now I'm dipping my brush in my red. I've rinsed out the blue. I'm just going to do a very thin layer of red. This is just a hint of evening. Once again, this is that alizarin crimson that we've been playing with all along. And now we have some yellow at the bottom. And you know, there's a fair amount of grass, so dip my brush in the yellow and apply it as I wish. And I'm filling it in all the way. And once I've done this, if I wanted to, I can try and rinse out my brush, really squeeze out that water so I can dry it on a paper towel or a rag. And if I wanted to, I can pull up any extra on the top. However, I got into a little trouble with my example that I have waiting in the wings. This is going to dry, and the trick with letting paper dry is you just leave it alone. Got a little bit of water on there if I want to. It's still very wet, and I could put a little bit more paint on there if I want to smooth it out. But once this begins to, lose its sheen a little bit, sometimes you see things that you don't like about it, and when it begins to lose its sheen, and then you start touching it up, and then you get what's called a back run, which we talked about in the last video. And it's better to have a little spot of white or something just a little bit off than to go into paper that is partially dry and then put some paint or water on there, and then it looks really dramatic and really not good. Let's see if I have an example. I have an example close by of a really, really bad. I actually messed up a picture on purpose for my students. All right, well, I'll have to look for it later. Anyway, trust me, you can hear things falling. Anyway, I'm not going to edit this video. It looks bad. Leave it alone. It's drying. I'm going to leave this alone. So this is just going to sit still for at least 10 minutes until it begins to lose its sheen. And once it begins to lose its sheen, then I will take a hairdryer and I'll just run a hairdryer all over it. Let's make it so you can really see the whole thing. And I'll even dry the back of it, and then I'll dry the front, and it might curl back and forth, and that's okay. It just means that one side has more water, and then you dry that side, and the other side dries more water, and it curls in the opposite direction. So wait until it's absolutely, completely dry before you do the next step. And lucky for you, just like Julia Child on her cooking shows, I have one already made up that I did earlier. Here it is. And you can see I tried to fix the edges. There was some beating up paint there, and it was a little bit damp, and I think I applied a little bit of water to it. But watercolor looks good no matter what. This one's ready to go. The pink line's a little bit higher up, but watercolor looks beautiful no matter what. That's the great thing about watercolor. Always looks good. And, happy accidents. We've got a happy accidents. I kind of like how the waters sort of run up a little bit and out in an interesting way. So, this one's ready to go. It's completely dry. It's not cold at all. I can really feel the texture. Sometimes when you put that first layer of paint, somehow it's like the texture becomes even more coarse. And I kind of like that. It really takes the paint well. And I'm going to add more red, more yellow, more blue to my palette here. So I'm going to dip my brush, rinse it out. Start with my blue. Yeah, I'm going to use this one for blue. That blue that takes over the world. PHTHALO. Phthalo blue. This is a lot of paint. I'm going to suck a little bit of this out. Put it over here. It's going to be difficult to make a dark blue if there's more than a teaspoon of water in there. So I'm just making this concentrated. I'm making a dark blue now. Before I had a very pale light blue. Now I'm making a very dark blue. So now I can go ahead and swatch these again. Swatching is really important for whenever you do a painting. So you see how much darker that is. And it's going to be kind of like this. A little bit more. We want a pow color. This is going to be all the shadows on the trunks of the trees. Okay, so now I want to put a lot of yellow on here. There's my yellow. There it is. I've got globs of it on there. Stir it in there. I need, I think, a little less yellow than I need of the blue anyway. And these colors are going to mix with each other on the paper. Here I kept them mostly separate. They bled a little bit into each other, but they're really going to mix into each other in this exercise. And I'm probably not going to use this brush because it's kind of big. I want something that comes to a good point. Or if I do use it, I'll only use the point of the brush. All right. Got one more brush I'm going to do for the red. Use my alizarin crimson. Stir it around. Forgot to test my yellow. I'll test out my yellow and my red in a minute. Want it to be very concentrated. Sometimes people talk about concentration of tea versus coffee versus milk versus cream. Cream is always a little too thick for watercolor in my mind. It's getting close, maybe even a little bit more. And I do find that I have to use more paint with Cotman than with the professional brands, but it still works quite well. So that's what it's going to look like if I were to layer it on top of each other or on the blue. Right, it's going to be kind of purplish because red and blue make purple. And see what the yellow looks like. Stir it around. Every time I go into a color that I haven't used for a few seconds, I stir it. Oh, that's a good yellow. Got a little blob on there. Sometimes it happens. Yeah, I think that's good. If you get a little blob of something, sometimes you can wipe it away with your finger, or you can let it dry and then remove it, although it might, if it's tissue, I think there's a little bit of tissue, it might pull extra paint to that area, so it's good to get it out of the way. All right, so here we go. We've got the underpainting, which is like you've got sky, you've got the pink of the horizon line, which is here, and you've got the yellow of the foreground. And we're going to start with the trees. So for the trees, I'm going to draw the trunks, and I'm going to draw that, just that horizon line right here. If I wanted to, I could get into doing that little tree off to the side. So you're not going to be able to see everything I'm doing with the photo. You'll have to refer to the photo that I've sent you already. Okay. Stirring it around, making sure no paint has settled on the bottom. Use the tip of my brush. I'm going to use a fair amount of blue. So I'm just thinking, where are these trees? Where are these trunks? And they're kind of, it's a loose painting. Sort of wacky and loose. You can't mess up. Everyone's tree is going to look a little bit different. If I want to really make the horizon line clear, if I want to have that hint of grass, I can do a bunch of little horizontal lines, hard to talk and paint at the same time. Paint little vertical lines and then draw a horizontal line on top of it. More kind of brambly in this area, a little gap, and more brambly over here. Get some more paint if it begins to feel dry. And there's some branches. This is kind of a big brush, but I'm doing it anyway. So branches that are kind of horizontal, I can do some horizontal lines in there. Add another tree. So you're just kind of playing around. There's no right or wrong way. There's some bushes in here. Make some more bush action over there. So we're having some fun. If I want to, I can add a little bit more over here because there's some green over on these bushes on the right side. So now I've done some blue. I'm going to take a break from the blue. I'm going to jump into the red. Oops. Mixing my brush around in the red. Don't want to wait too long. I want to do this while this is still wet. They're going to mix together on the paper. It's going to be really pretty. So I'm doing kind of a blobby, branchy. These are trees in autumn. Sunset. I'm making autumn colors, and right now it's very purple. I could do some of these guys over here too. Got the tops of some trees or some bushes over here. If I want to do some further down for leafiness, more on the sides of the trees, I can do that. But maybe there's some light and not so shadowy. Okay, that's probably good enough. And now I'm going to do some yellow. Saved my small brush for yellow. That was not intentional, but it's what happened. So here we go. I'm going to mix the yellow in with that red. We're just going to have some fun. I could put yellow farther down, keep it from being quite so purple and more of an autumnal sort of color range. Red, yellow, and blue. Pardon me. So, scribbly, fun, suggestive. And yours will look different, and that is fine. If I want to put some really far down in here, get some green, I can. Let's put some over here. And I don't have to stick with just one pass. I can go over back with more blue or more red if I want to. All right, I'm going to go back in with some blue. I'm going to put some blue and see how it's bleeding together. This blue that I first laid down dried out, so it's not bleeding, but I can touch back in and let it bleed. Maybe a little I'm just doing dots, depositing just little blobs of paint here and there. Then we'll do some red, more red down in the bottom. They still have their predominant areas where it's more red and more yellow and more blue, but you know, it's all about fun. That looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. That's good. So now maybe I'll do a little bit of foreground here. So it's a lot of, I see some warm, almost sort of pinkish, and I see it being a little bit darker in the foreground, but I'm not going to worry about that. I think I'm just going to maybe put a little bit of blue in with that yellow. Rinse that out. Use my big brush on this, squeezing out water. So I've removed most of the water. I rinsed it out and I squeezed the water out with my fingers, just squeezing it like that. And now I can stir this around. We've got kind of a more greenish yellow, and I can play around with some leafy, grassy shapes. My previous ones I did more horizontal lines, but this time I'm going more vertical. Just giving it some depth. Having smaller shapes, having warm shapes in the foreground helps bring this forward. And I can also maybe take just a little bit of red, get some other warm colors in there. Maybe have, you know, some gaps. Don't do it evenly all over the place. If I want to have a little bit of horizontal, I think I'll do just a little bit of horizontal, just a little bit. Probably too much. If it's too much, we'll just grab some yellow. I'm not precious about this yellow right next to it. It's almost gone anyway. Maybe a tiny bit of red in there. Am I going to ruin it? What if I just do it just a tiny bit? Just a little bit of horizontal. Just barely touching it. Yep. And if I want to do some big blobs, I can. I can also rinse out my brush and just put some clear water on there. Dilute some of it. I mean, you were messing around. This is the thing. It's bugging me that this is not connected with anything. So, oh, now I've got some red on my brush. So, we're having fun. You're messing around. You're going to make a picture. It's going to be unique. It's going to be your own. It's going to be different every single time you do it. Right? Every time it's going to be a little bit different. It's an experiment, and we're having a good time. All right, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next class.